What's going on, guys? Welcome back to my channel. This is Lior. What I thought I would do in some of these videos, a lot of my recent videos have been on-site videos, taking you through a lot of my sites that are actively under construction. So you've seen a lot of my sites in the city, in the suburbs, like some spec single families. And what I thought I would do is kind of take it back to the boardroom and talk about some more of the strategic aspects of development, right? And in particular with this video, one of the things that I think has been really important, especially in the changing environment we've had in the real estate market, right? I mean, it seems like every pocket of the country is really affected, but specifically in Boston, kind of greater Boston area, there's been a lot of changes in the types of product that move, right? So what I thought I would talk about is, in today's environment, right, what are the locations and product strategy that I'm thinking about for my next condo projects, given all the volatility in today's market? So I have a very thick stack of notes here. I just kind of compiled a list of all the markets I'm looking at, and then really breaking it down specifically what neighborhoods within those markets I'm looking at, and then what kind of product I would deliver in these markets today based on all the risk factors, all the trends, again, specifically happening within Boston and 20 minutes outside the city. That's really my radius of development. Let's kick it right off, right? And one of the reasons this kind of idea popped to me is, as you guys have probably seen my other videos, I'm finishing up a 3-phase project right now in East Boston, right? It's a 16-unit condo project, and it's really got me thinking, what would be the next big project I would want to tackle, right? Again, there's specific neighborhoods within the city, and I would call it city adjacent, right? So 15, 20, 25 minutes outside the city, that I think have interesting dynamics that could still work for condo projects today. But again, each one of these neighborhood cities has got its own specific niche, in my opinion, of what kind of product actually works today in terms of development offering, and what doesn't work, right? So let's go right into it. So let's start with the city, right? And I want to talk about specific neighborhoods within the city that I still think are interesting to me in terms of potentially developing condo projects. And at a high level, I think it doesn't really come as a surprise that really for these neighborhoods that I'm choosing are all about quality of location in the city, right? I think today I really only want to build in areas that have real lifestyle amenities in the city, and that are truly desirable pockets within the city, right? So there needs to be lifestyle value as well as comfort with the general area, right? So let's dive right into the list. So number one is Southie, or South Boston, right? Still one of my personal favorite neighborhoods in the city. I lived there for 6 years, right? So I know it very, very well. And, even though I haven't done a project yet there, actually, I've been looking, and it's hard, and I'll talk about why I haven't done a project there. It's a very unique area for development, right? Where, over the last 12, 18, 24 months, new units that do come online, they still move pretty well. They still move at pretty good pricing, right? A lot of the condo product in that area moves at around 900 per square foot, plus up to 1,000, depending on exact location, amenity package, parking, all that stuff, right? But, despite the condo market having its ebbs and flows, right? And that's certainly been a theme, in Boston in the last year or two, really, right? Where, some condo product and some city condo product doesn't move as well. Southie continues to still be very much in demand, right? From from a end buyer perspective, right? It offers a lot of lifestyle amenities. There's tons of restaurants, bars. There's new recreational activities happening there, right? Shout out, for example, I play pickleball in a brand new pickleball club that opened in South Boston. So it just has a lot going on that people really want, right? But to me, honestly, the biggest hurdle with Southie in terms of actually finding a development project is it's expensive, right? The trade-off for it being a resilient market in terms of its pricing, in terms of its demand, is that your acquisition basis is still pretty tough, in my opinion. I've underwritten a lot of deals over there, and I think between really, really high land basis, a lot of owners that are sitting on lots, empty lots or teardowns, they're just still asking for the absolute world. You know, it just makes it really hard to underwrite, in my opinion, enough margin of a project. As much as I love to deliver there, I haven't found anything, but I'm sure at some point I will. So that's neighborhood number one. Neighborhood number two, East Boston, right? So East Boston, again, that's where I have my current 16-unit condo project that I'm finishing up on Bremen Street, which is, you know, if you're not super familiar with that, it's right on the edge of Jeffries Point, which is kind of the more, you know, in my opinion, more desirable neighborhood within East Boston, right? So proper Jeffries Point, you have some streets that are close to the water. There are a good amount of lifestyle amenities there. They do have some good parks. There's some breweries there. There's parks on the water. There's restaurants on the water there. That waterfront area has really been developed. So, you know, if I were to go develop a project today in East Boston, it would have to be either in Jeffries Point, or I would certainly do another project on Bremen Street. That depends on the pocket. So, for example, my pocket, my area of where I'm building my Bremen Street buildings, they are directly across the street from the Bremen Street Park. So my buildings overlook a huge park. So it's just a bunch of green space. There's no triple deckers on the other side of the street, which I think is a huge lifestyle amenity. Not to forget that the MBTA T stop is literally across the street from my buildings, the Blue Line. So that's a really big park, in my opinion. So, you know, I would stick to these areas, Jeffries and Bremen. You know, I still think this corridor commands pretty good interest from buyers. I'm seeing that on the sales side of my units as well. And, you know, one of the things I've learned with this project, which I think is really important, is, you know, there are more sophisticated buyers in these neighborhoods who are now actually paying up for premium product, right? And that's important, right? Because one of my theses is to deliver premium, exceptional product, and regardless of the neighborhood I'm in you know, that I develop in. And, you know, even though this wasn't always the case in East Boston, today I am noticing that buyers are starting to be more discerning in that neighborhood, and they are paying, you know, higher price per foot pricing for either product that's really well located and or is finished really well, right? And that's really worthwhile. Now, there are a few other pockets in or right in the city or right next to the city that I would look at. You know, there are parts of Dorchester that I would still potentially consider developing in. I do think there's some locations in Dorchester that still trade pretty well. You know, the kind of more desirable neighborhoods, in my opinion, you know, like the Savin Hill, the area by JFK UMass, right? That's right on the T stop. If you go more south in Dorchester towards like Adams Village, Ashmont, Ponset, Lower Mills, you know, these would be the areas I would still seriously look at delivering a condo project there. You know, one of the tougher things about developing these areas is the price per foot's there on the back end for condo product is still not quite as high as I think it needs to be, given that construction costs here going to be basically the same as, you know, in South Boston, East Boston, doesn't really matter. Obviously, your land basis is lower, but, you know, I do think, you know, it is tough to pencil some of these deals out because, you know, it's hard to really push huge premiums on the back end. But again, if the right project penciled out in the right location, I would still absolutely tackle it. Now, in terms of other neighborhoods that I'll spit off, Charlestown, I've looked at a couple of deals there. It's a very established, very in demand, in my opinion, has a lot of the same lifestyle amenities as a neighborhood like South Boston, right? A lot of established parks, restaurants, bars, things to do, you know. So in my opinion, you know, if you can find a good site, if I could find a good site, I would absolutely look really hard there. The price per foot's there. Of course, justify the back end there too, right? You can certainly push your pricing in Charlestown, but again, it's just hard. It's certainly harder to find deals that pencil because, you know, a lot of landowners or anyone that owns a teardown knows what they own, and, you know, as of today, they've still been pushing their land bases, right? They're not giving away land, and it's still tricky to find deals there. And then included in the city, even though it's technically not Boston, you know, areas like Cambridge, I would still absolutely look at. I'm actually breaking ground myself on a condo project in Cambridge very shortly, where we're going to do 7 brand new construction units, pretty close to the T stop in North Cambridge neighborhood. So I've been pretty aggressive about putting in offers. You know, I still think the right location, the right product offering in these in this area would do really well. Now, speaking of product offerings, so I just kind of went through locations in the city. I think it's really important to talk about what I think is the right type of product mix to deliver in today's market, right? And I do have a very specific criteria about what I'm willing to build and what I'm not willing to build in the city today. So for me, basically in all of these neighborhoods, outside of like, I'm sure there's probably some exception to the rule that I could find, but at a pretty general level, when I'm looking at city condo development, in terms of unit mix, I'm really looking at delivering smaller units today, right? My biggest units that I would probably consider delivering is right around 1,200, maybe 1,300 square feet plus minus. I'm really not looking to deliver anything substantially bigger, right? So once you get into the 1,500 square foot plus unit size, I just don't think that's the right type of product mix for today's environment. With a 1,200, 1,300 square feet and below, so anything 1,000. The nice thing about this size for condo product is that, it does help me push my price point lower. And ideally, I like to be sub $1 million on my price point. For a lot of these neighborhoods, again, there's obviously exceptions to the rule. But the reason I'm really sensitive about this, kind of being in that $1 million price point plus minus and below is, my thesis is the smaller price per unit idea is really based on the fact that rates have been obviously high. That's no secret. Everyone knows interest rates have been high. And I think they likely will remain, they're likely going to stay high over the foreseeable future, right? And I think the risk with larger units today is, if you're delivering 1,500 square foot to 2,000 square foot plus units, right? Those are obviously coming at very large price points, right? You're at bare minimum typically looking low millions. If you're delivering that in a neighborhood like South Boston, Charlestown, even Cambridge, right? I see a lot of competition in Cambridge that's delivering, that's building and trying to deliver large units at close to $1,000 per foot pricing, which means they're targeting mid one all the way up to $2 million plus in their price points. I think that's a really risky price point in today's environment, right? Because here's the problem with that price point is, if you're someone able to spend $1.5–2 million price point, I think the trends in Boston the last 24 plus months have shown that, the city is doing okay, but it's not like people are flooding into the city. And these people that can spend 1.5 million plus, typically the typical buyer, if you've got that kind of buying power, you're going to the suburbs, right? You're typically going and you're either looking at single families, maybe you're looking at townhouses, which I'll talk about in my next section. But you're probably going to want either more space, larger lot, larger yard, right? I think it's been a little bit, I just don't see it as a stable demand of, the buyer pool that is able to spend $1.5–2 million plus that wants to stay in the city. Now, again, of course, exceptions to the rule. There's certainly projects that have shown that they can sell some larger units in Southie. I've seen it in Charlestown. I've seen it in Cambridge. But I do think it's an uphill battle personally, right? I don't know how resilient that buyer pool is, in my opinion. And I think if I'm staying in that sub $1 million price point, I'm exposing myself to a much larger buyer pool, right? It's basically, the young couple, young professional, or even downsizers that I've seen walk these units. You don't need a ton of space. You can kind of work yourself into a 900 square foot or 1,000 square foot 2-bed. Maybe you're going on the larger side, 2-bed, 3-bed, 1,200, 1,300 square feet. But it functionally meets all your needs. These sort of end buyers, they have pretty good salaries, right? They have good work. They're not making $1 million a year plus, right? But they have good money coming in. A lot of them, it could be their first time they're buying a condo. They could be moving down from a luxury apartment, and this could be their first purchase. But I just think that buyer pool is a lot more open in this price point, and I really execute on what I harp on, right? So in Cambridge, for example, the condo project I mentioned, All my units are basically sub 1,100 square foot units that I'm about to start on. Even my East Boston project, of the 3 phases in the 16 units, phase 1 was basically 800, 900 square foot, 2-bed, 2-bath. Phase 2 was like 900 to about 1,000 square foot, a little bit higher than 1,000 square foot, 2-bed, 2-baths plus dens. And then the final phase that I'm delivering right now, I've got 2-bed, 2-baths in the 900 to 1,000 square feet. I do have a couple of larger 2-bed plus den and 3 beds that are in the 12 to 1,400 square foot range. I would say that definitely is on the larger side of what what I would consider delivering today. But again, I really do believe that there's just a much larger buyer pool. I think pushing into that price point again, into the $1.52 million plus, I just think that buyer has too many options. I think they can go to the suburbs, get way more space, get way more better yard space than they would in a condo building. So that's kind of that long-winded answer about why I really strongly believe about really being targeted about the smaller unit sizes in the city today, right? I think the risk profile is too high with larger units. So that's that reason. So now that we kind of talked about the city markets, let's talk a little bit about the city adjacent markets, right? So for me, I recently exited a couple of townhouse and condo projects in Newton and Watertown. I have another Watertown condo project lined up and ready to go. So, what are some of the markets I'm looking at for more kind of like townhouse and condo projects, that is adjacent to the city? So big 3 cities in my radar is Watertown, Waltham, Arlington, and kind of the immediate surroundings. One of the reasons I like these locations, right? So first, I do think you have a lot of buyers that are, either leasing in the city or maybe own, maybe have lived in a smaller condo for several years. Maybe it's like a single person or a couple. They're ready to kind of graduate to that next step where maybe they want a little bit more space. Maybe they're thinking about expanding their family. So I think that's a big buyer pool that kind of migrates from the city into potential condo and townhouse product in the suburbs. I actually have also seen downsizers come into townhouse product from the deep suburbs. So one of the Newton projects I'll talk about, one of my buyers that was a downsizer that came from a large single family in the deep suburbs. Their kids were off to school. They didn't need that space. They wanted to be a little closer to the city. They wanted brand new product, and a Newton townhouse fit the description perfectly. And, one of the nice things here for these buyers is, again, they can get a little bit better value in their price per foot, right? So their money goes a little bit further. They can get a little bit more space for a similar dollar. And especially when you compare Watertown, Waltham, Arlington versus Newton, you really do get a little bit more value, right? So that same dollar can get you a lot more space, which I think is nice. Townhouse product, I think, is really ideal in these areas, right? Because it does feel like for a lot of these buyers like single family living, where they have up down living. They might have like a finished basement, first, second floor, potentially third floor. They get some yard space. So it really is a nice single family alternative. But larger condo style units certainly also do work in this area as well, right? I mean, townhouses are a great fit, but I think if you can do larger condos, that can fit a lot of the needs. And I'll talk more about that product fit. Now, in terms of townhouses, so let's talk about actually like spec of product that I want to deliver in these areas, right? So townhouse product, generally we're looking at about units around, call it 2,000 square feet, maybe 3 to 4 beds. I think it's kind of the sweet spot. So the project I just exited in Watertown, we just finished 2 brand new construction townhomes. I think it was really great product fit. It was 2 units, about 2,100 square feet, 4 beds, 4 baths, 4 floors of living, extra office, 2 living rooms, right? And that just gives that end buyer a lot of flexibility in terms of how they can use that space, right? Because again, if you think about that end buyer, it's going to be probably either like a younger couple that's about to start their family, could be some we did have some downsizing interest as well. But either way, right, you're probably going to use one of the rooms as like a kid's room or a baby room. You're probably going to want a guest room for anyone that's visiting you. And then you're probably going to want 1 or 2 offices / work from home spaces. right? And then, you know, and then there's always some sort of creativity with how people use an extra room. So you kind of do get that you do really get that usage from, you know, that 3 to 4 bedrooms, plenty of living space. So I think it really does fit really nicely. Now, if we're going more, now if we're going to talk condo product, I would say the idea is the same. And again, just to differentiate, the condos would be up-down splits, right? Where you cut it this way as opposed to townhouses, vertical living. Condo splits, I would say similar to townhouse concept, but very different than what we were talking about in the city, right? Because again, remember the city, we were trending smaller units, you know, call it 2-bed, 2-bath, 800-900 square feet, maybe 1,000, not that much more. Here again, you know, I'm designing a new project right now in Watertown. It's going to be condo style units, and we're hitting around 1,800 to 2,000 square foot units. So I would say the ideal range is probably 15 to 2,000 if I really wanted the perfect project. Because again, here, right, like the pitch is you're going to be able to get 3 to 4 beds, 3 to 4 full baths, maybe an extra office space. Again, you're going to want to pitch buyers that they have that kid/baby room, depending on who that end buyer is. Probably, again, at least 1, a lot of times 2 work from home offices or spaces, plus a flex room, guest room, right? So these bedrooms really do get eat up a lot. So even with that, you know, even if we're going condos, you know, I probably don't want to go too much smaller than like 1,400 square feet. It would probably be the smallest. Because again, if I'm gonna be delivering like 1,900 square foot, it's not gonna really hit the check boxes for a lot of these buyers that we see coming into to these sort of adjacent, city adjacent pockets, if you will. So that's kind of the thesis in terms of what, you know, when we're delivering, you know, again, Watertown, Waltham, Arlington, you know, price points wise, you know, for these sorts of for this kind of square footage, I usually want to be comfortably around the $1 million to maybe low $1 million price point. You know, that it's kind of a sweet spot for a lot of these buyers, right? Because again, typically, again, the end buyer that's coming in here is usually dual income. So you're getting pretty good financial profile for a buyer. They can typically pull, you know, again, $1 million. $1 million is probably the sweet spot, honestly. Once you know, again, depending on the town, obviously Arlington's going to be a little bit higher. But once you start going to 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, you know, as you're pushing that price point up, again, depending on the exact location, it's probably okay. But, you know, for example, if it's like in Watertown and you're pushing into the mid $1 millions, that can get a little dicier. So I think, you know, if we're going to look at a project like that, I'm probably going to really analyze that exact price point in that exact neighborhood in that exact city. But again, as a general rule of thumb, I think being in that, you know, $1 million to low $1 million price range for these sorts of towns, I think is very doable, and does have a good end buyer demand to it. So that's these 3 towns. The last town I want to cover, or city I want to cover actually, is Newton, which I do a lot of work in. If you follow my channel, if you follow my social, you know that I do a lot of projects there. So for townhouses there, we actually just exited this year a townhouse project. Now that one was an interesting project because those I delivered really large units. It was like mid to high 3,000 square foot range. We pushed close to $2 million price points on those. Even though we got those price points, I'd say if I'm gonna do another townhouse project like that, I think pushing into that price point on another project, I don't know if I would necessarily jump into that. My ideal kind of townhouse range in Newton would be similar to what I talked about with these other towns, which is, you know, maybe low to mid 2,000 square feet in terms of townhouse size. Maybe I would push into like the high 2,000s up to 3,000 square feet at most, I would say. And again, the reason for that is price point, right? So in that kind of square footage range, again, I'm dealing with low to mid $1 million price range. Once I really start to push up that square footage range, I usually have to, you know, in order to kind of capture the money back, I do have to push price into that high $1 million price range, and start floor with 2, depending on location, size, etc. And here's the problem with that, right? Is especially in today's market, that once you start pushing the $2 million price point, in my opinion, that buyer has a lot more flexibility in terms of, you know, alternatives, right? So once you're pushing in the $2 million range, they could probably start looking at pretty decent single families, you know, in that low mid 1 million price range. If you're a buyer in Newton, you're probably not going to find much for single family, and that's why it's a nice sweet spot, right? Because in that low to mid 1 million range, you know, if you're finding a single family, trust me, I've looked, it's going to need work. It's probably going to be on the smaller side. The lot's not going to be great. It's really once you push into that $2 million price range, you start to get a little bit more flexibility in terms of size, location, lot. So that $2 million townhouse buyer has a little bit more options. You know, whereas again, low mid to 1 million is a little more confined. And again, I just think with that $2 million price range for townhouses, you know, not only can you look at alternative single families, but you can really look at alternative towns. That kind of price point around here does carry some decent weight. And you can really go wherever you know, more or less wherever you want. Obviously, you're not going to go into like insane, like, you know, Brookline might be a little more outpriced. Maybe Wellesley would be a little bit more outpriced. But for the most part, at $2 million, that buyer has some, you know, does have some more options. And I will say that pool is more limited, right? Because at that price point, that, you know, that buyer needs to have much stronger financial profile, in my opinion. You're usually looking at two very strong income sources, or a downsizer who has maybe a lot of equity from their previous home. All certainly possible, but again, I just think it limits your pool of on your end buyer. So that's why, you know, on future projects and projects that I've been underwriting, really looking to hit that sweet spot of like say 2,000 to 3,000 square feet, low to mid $1 million price range. You have a greater pool of buyers. It's easier. It's kind of an easier pill to swallow for that end buyer. And again, ultimately, I think it de-risks the project having these kinds of units to sell, increases the velocity on the back end. So that's kind of why I'm more focused on that niche within Newton if I were to look at townhouse, not if, but as I'm looking at townhouse projects today. So that hopefully gives you guys a pretty good idea of how I'm evaluating these different markets. Again, you can see that it's really a function of multiple factors, right? It's, of course, understanding where the market and interest rate environment is, right? That's huge. Understanding what price points are kind of more agile today versus not. As mentioned, you know, once you're starting to climb into $2 million price point, really anywhere, it starts to get a little friskier, especially with condo product. But then it's really also understanding who that end buyer is and what are they looking for, right? In the city, we can deliver smaller product because, again, it's usually first-time condo buyers, or maybe it's a trade-up condo buyer that's still okay with the city, smaller city space in exchange for lifestyle amenities. Whereas, you know, when you go city adjacent, 20, 25 minutes out, you know, that 2,000 to 3,000 square foot townhouse product is a great single family alternative. Again, assuming the pricing makes sense, they're getting that feel of a single family with multi-level living. You know, they could have that backyard. It can really feel more like a single family without paying the huge premium that that a new construction single family, for example, that would cost in that same town. So really understanding who that buyer is, what they're looking for, what their mentality is, understanding what pricing segment we want to be in. That's kind of how my analysis. And again, as I'm underwriting deals basically every day, that's how I'm thinking about, does this project make sense in today's environment? Is this a void that I really want to hit? So hopefully that makes sense, guys. Let me know if you have any comments or questions below.